Stop the presses! Usually that's an exclamation of surprise. It's meant to grab people's attention and encourage them to learn something important. Today I hold in my hand the last print edition of the Tribune. From now on, the venerable Southern Oregon publication will exist only in digital format on the World Wide Web. I know it's impossible to fully comprehend and appreciate the unparalleled significance of this pivotal moment in human history. But I'm going to try to explain why it matters so much. Johann Gutenberg was a German inventor, printer, publisher, and goldsmith who in the year 1450 introduced printing to Europe with his mechanical movable type printing press. His work started the printing revolution in Europe and is regarded as a milestone of the second millennium, ushering in the modern period of human history. It played a key role in the development of the Renaissance, Reformation, Age of Enlightenment, and Scientific Revolution, as well as laying the material basis for the modern knowledge-based economy and the spread of learning to the masses. While not the first to use movable type in the world, that honorific belongs to a Chinese artisan, engineer, and inventor named Bi Sheng, who lived from 972 to 1051 AD. Gutenberg was the first European to do so. His many contributions to printing include the invention of a process for mass-producing movable type, the use of oil-based ink for printing books, adjustable molds, mechanical movable type, and the use of a wooden printing press similar to the agricultural screw press of the period. His truly epochal invention was the combination of these elements into a practical system that allowed the mass production of printed books and was economically viable for printers and readers alike. Gutenberg's method for making type is traditionally considered to have included a type metal alloy and a hand mold for casting type. The alloy was a mixture of lead, tin, and antimony that melted at a relatively low temperature for faster and more economical casting, cast well, and created durable type. Public occurrences, both foreign and domestic. The first newspaper published in America was printed by Richard Pierce and edited by Benjamin Harris in Boston on September 25, 1690. It contained 3 printed pages and 1 blank. The pages were about 6 by 10 inches in size in a folded sheet of paper. Harris was a former publisher of Whig books, pamphlets, and a newspaper in London. He had fled England with his family 4 years earlier after clashing with authorities for publishing seditious pamphlets, leading to uncomfortable episodes in the pillory and jail. Public occurrences was intended to be furnished once a month, or, if any glut of occurrences happened, oftener. Unfortunately, Harris once again ran afoul of the government, and official reaction was swift and certain. 4 days after distribution, the governor and council issued a statement disallowing the publication, claiming it had been issued without the least privity or countenance of authority. Particularly knowing to the powers that be with some gossip regarding the immoralities of the King of France and an account of recent events of the French and Indian War. Harris denounced the barbarous ways in which the Indian allies of the English had treated their French captives, declaring high resentment and disallowance of said pamphlet. The government ordered that public occurrences be suppressed and called in. It was further ordered that nothing would be set to print in the future without prior authority. Ultimately, the first newspaper published in America became the first to be suppressed by the authorities. Flash forward 300 years into the future, newspaper business has come a long way since Benjamin Harris published that first and only edition of Public Occurrences back in 1690. He undoubtedly would have had a hard time imagining the circulation figures of current-day newspapers or the highly evolved newsprint machines that produce the millions of tons of paper used by publishers. Before the internet changed everything, newspapers remained one of the most desired mediums for news and information. In 2003, more than 54 million newspapers were sold daily. On any given Sunday, more than 58 million newspapers are sold with an average of 2.4 readers per copy. Preliminary data also shows that U.S. newsprint consumption stood at 10.3 million metric tons in that same year. Moving on, in 1876, a German clockmaker, Ottmar Mergenthaler, who had emigrated to the United States in 1872, was approached by James O. Cliffane and his associate Charles T. Moore, who sought a quicker way of publishing legal briefs. By 1884, he conceived the idea of assembling metallic letter molds called matrices and casting molten metal into them, all within a single machine. His first attempt proved the idea feasible, and a new company was formed. Improving his invention, Mergenthaler further developed his idea of an independent matrix machine. In July 1886, the first commercially used linotype was installed in the printing office of the New York Tribune. Here, it was immediately used on the daily paper and a large book. The book, the first ever composed with the new linotype method, was titled The Tribune Book of Open Air Sports. Here in Southern Oregon, Medford's first newspaper was called The Monitor, and it began circulation in 1885. The Mel Tribune newspaper, as we know it today, was founded in 1907 by a man named George Putnam. For over 100 years, the Mel Tribune has argued against what it perceived to be dangerous, irrational, or unfair, if often popular, political measures, facing libel suits, jailings, death threats, and boycotts as a result. The newspaper was created in the 1906 merger of the Southern Oregon Mail, a proponent of political reform, published in Medford since 1888, and the Tribune, which began publication in Ashland in 1894. The Mel Tribune earned recognition and respect from journalists for its public service and was the first Oregon newspaper to win a Pulitzer Prize in 1934. Born on September 10, 1872, into a New England family, Putnam took engineering classes at the University of Nebraska and worked briefly as a civil engineer in San Diego. But since childhood, he had a journalistic bent. In 1899, he was hired to be newspaper publisher E.W. Scripps' private secretary, and he went on to work for newspapers in Spokane, Washington, Eureka, California, and Portland. In 1907, Putnam bought the Medford Tribune and two small weeklies. In 1910, he purchased the Medford Mail, creating the Mel Tribune. Putnam's notoriety began in January of 1908 when he challenged the actions of a Jackson County political machine. He was new in town when the small railroad line connecting Medford and Jacksonville came under fire for poor service. Railroad Commissioner Oswald West came to Medford to investigate. Putnam was on hand when the railroad owner, W.S. Barnum, angrily threw an axe at Medford Mayor J.F. Reddy, narrowly missing his head. A grand jury was convened, and Deputy District Attorney Clarence Reams called 6 men who were friends of Barnum but had not witnessed the incident, and one actual witness, Putnam. The result was a not true bill, which Putnam quickly labeled a grand jury farce. The prosecutor and grand jury proceeded to try the case, which should have been left to a trial jury, and in spite of these facts, voted not to bring in a true bill. There is no doubt in the world that W.S. Barnum, in a fit of insane rage, did try to kill J.F. Reddy with an axe, struck at him, chased him, and threw the axe at his head. That he did not split Dr. Reddy's head open was not Mr. Barnum's fault. He did his best, and the attack was not in self-defense, but unprovoked and wanton. The grand jury indicted Putnam for libel against the jurors. He was pulled off a train in Roseburg and spent the night with criminals in a vermin-infested, overcrowded prison before Roseburg editor posted his bail. At trial, Putnam's attorneys relied on Oregon law declaring that truth is a defense against libel. Judge H.K. Hanna denied all attempts to allow witnesses, including West, Reddy, and Putnam himself, to testify about the axe-throwing incident, proclaiming that the grand jury had decided the truth of the matter when it refused to indict Barnum. Stripped of his major defense, Putnam was found guilty and fined $150. Oregon newspapers rallied behind Putnam, who rejected a pardon by Governor George Chamberlain as his appeal went forward. In State v. Putnam, decided on March 9, 1909, Justice Robert S. Bean concluded that it is clearly competent for the defendant to show that the statements made by him and set out in the indictment were in fact true, and because he was denied this right, the judgment must be reversed and a new trial ordered. The case was not retried, but Putnam was physically assaulted and at least twice before he bought his revolver. The entire state of reform candidates he endorsed won the 1908 election in Jackson County. In 1919, Putnam sold the Medford paper to purchase the Salem Capital Journal, so he was a new editor in the capital city when the Ku Klux Klan began efforts to dominate Oregon politics. Putnam sold the Tribune to Robert Rule and S. Sumner Smith in 1919. As editor, Rule proclaimed the paper an independent force for better government in the Rogue River Valley. In the early 1920s, the Mail Tribune editorialized strongly against the increasing influence of the Ku Klux Klan in the state, one of few Oregon newspapers to do so. Facing a boycott of the newspaper by advertisers and Klan supporters, Rule hoped that in a time not too far distant, the widespread report that Jackson County is a hotbed of Ku Klux Klanism can be finally and permanently denied. During 1932 and 1933, in the depth of the Depression, the Mail Tribune survived another boycott and threatened violence by supporters of a local populist insurgency called the Good Government Congress, led by the demagogic owner and editor of a competing daily, the Medford News. The Good Government Congress episodes severely roiled Southern Oregon politics and society. Its violent end in the early 1933 brought national attention to the region as well as Pulitzer Prize to the Mail Tribune for its leadership. And Eric W. Allen Jr. took over the editorial reins of the paper in 1964 and soon gained a reputation as a supporter of civil rights, handgun control, land use planning, controls on air and water pollution, and other issues that were unpopular with many Mail Tribune subscribers. Under Allen's leadership, the newspaper supported progressive candidates for state and national offices regardless of which party they represented. It's never pleasant to be damned, and I was, Allen wrote, adding, I'm a good forgetter, too. He was a fervent believer in the First Amendment. Cherish it as you would your lives, he wrote, for without the First Amendment, your lives would almost assuredly be hardly worth living. After its purchase by Ottawa Newspapers, a subsidiary of Dow Jones, in 1973, the Mail Tribune moved into 2 new buildings, added a Saturday edition, and became a morning publication. It also dropped Medford from its nameplate as it became more of a regional publication. News Corporation bought Dow Jones in 2007 and sold the Tribune in 2013 to Newcastle Investment, which assigned operations to Gatehouse Media, which oversees some 400 newspapers and 350 related websites. The Mail Tribune, the Ashland Daily Tidings, and the Nickel, a weekly shopper, now make up the Southern Oregon Media Group, created when News Corporation purchased the 3 publications. The Mail Tribune and all other Southern Oregon Media Group properties were sold to Rosebud Media in January of 2017. According to former Mail Tribune editor Bob Hunter, the paper remains a strong advocate for Medford and the Rogue Valley, one that does not shy away from what he terms constructive criticism of governmental entities. Continuing in the watchdog role pioneered by Putnam and carried on by Rule and Allen, the newspaper won a number of awards, including being honored by the Oregon Newspaper Publishers Association as the best paper in its circulation class for 2011 to 2014, and being named Gatehouse Newspaper of the Year in 2014. Hunter retired as Mail Tribune editor effective September 17, 2016. Appointed as his replacement was Kathy Noah, the paper's city editor since 2007. Noah is the first female editor in the Mail Tribune's 110-year history. Everything was all fine and dandy until the internet came along. Mail Tribune print circulation has been declining in the past decade, according to Hunter, but he adds, online readership has more than offset that, with the unique online visitor numbers exceeding the declines in circulation. Hunter says the Mail Tribune is definitely a digital-first organization, moving all news and many features as they are finished, rather than waiting until the print publication is out. I made a commitment to the Rogue Valley to keep a printed newspaper as long as we could break even. We eclipsed that a long time ago, owner and publisher Stephen Saslow, who bought the newspaper 5 years ago, said in a story posted to the paper's own website. Saslow said printing and delivery costs for the newspaper were threatening the business. The paper's website gets 1.8 million to 2.3 million views per month, he added, and the number of online readers is about 3 times higher than the number of print readers. I'm sure a lot of people will be unhappy. People like me and older grew up with a physical newspaper, he said. The transition will involve laying off about 15 people involved in printing the paper, according to the Mail Tribune, along with about 40 independent newspaper delivery contractors. The company's remaining staff, including the newsroom and advertising department, will be about 40 to 50 people. These days, many newspaper agencies all over America maintain online newspapers. The first newspaper to publish digital content was the Columbus Dispatch in 1980, courtesy of CompuServe dial-up service. This predates the mainstream use of the World Wide Web by about 18 years. Studies have shown that older Americans are newspapers' most loyal readers, while people born after 1980 largely don't subscribe to newspapers. So each year, a few million newspaper readers die and are not replaced by new readers. In 2015, print media accounted for 4% of people's time, but captured 16% of the ad revenue. In contrast, mobile devices captured a quarter of the people's time, but only about 1/8 of ad spending. The situation can't last. Over time, advertisers will realize that they can get more bang for their buck by advertising on new media platforms, and so newspaper ad revenue is likely to decline even more rapidly than its audience does. Of course, the people who run newspapers have known that this challenge was coming for a decade or more, and virtually all of them know that a transition to the internet is essential for their long-term survival. Virtually all daily newspapers are now trying to make their websites into viable businesses that can thrive in a post-print world. Advertising is a cyclical business. Newspapers traditionally lose ad revenue during recessions and regain ground during recoveries. The last recession was unusually severe, and the current recovery hasn't provided the bounce back newspapers were hoping for. So the next downturn is likely to be at least as bad as the last one, possibly so bad that a lot of newspapers won't survive. So there you have it, folks. Over 1,000 years of tumultuous human history has been washed down the drain because of money. That's progress for you. That was a very interesting history lesson. As I've said before, this decision to switch from the print edition to an online format, there's just no word to express how important this is. Life's going to change. I mean, look, for years, this is how you read the paper. You look at the front page, and you look at the headlines, you can feel the paper in your hand, hear the crinkle of the paper as you're reading it. Even the ink has a certain alluring smell to it, doesn't it? And so you look at the paper. You'd always read the weather. We're in October now, by the way, so our weather's still pretty warm. We're experiencing daytime highs in the mid-80s and lower 90s every day so far. And there's what's going on in this last edition. Let's see if we can comment on some history here. I feel like Jay Leno. Well, there's There's some obituaries. That's sad. I don't want to read those. Well, not a whole lot going on in this paper on this particular day. Let's see. Well, I guess one thing you won't miss about reading a newspaper is that you have to have two hands to do it, and you got them stretched out wide. You know, but this is what we're used to by and large, reading our paper like this. Let's see. 2 students, 4 schoolworkers shot. Oh, that's too sad. Train slammed into empty rail cars, killing 2. That's more sad. Alright, well. It's the end of an era. Yeah. The end of print. At least for the Mail Tribune. And maybe it's not permanent. You know, they might decide they made a mistake and they'll put these back into production. But, I mean, this is quite a bit different. You read your paper like this, or you're going to be moving from this physical newspaper, to a little handheld device. This is how you'll be reading the paper. Oh, okay. Gee. It's not very glamorous. You know, at least a newspaper is dignified. It commands respect. You know, this is the way people have been getting their news for, like I said earlier when I was reading the history to you, for the better part of 1,000 years. I mean, even the ancient Romans had a publication. They didn't have a printing press. It was all done by hand. It was a painstaking process. But all throughout human history, it seems like we've been able to communicate to each other through the written word, through print. And what's cool about the newspaper is that, you know, everybody becomes informed about what's going on in their world or in their town. And sometimes someone will say something and someone else might agree with it, and a whole bunch of people might agree with it. That's why freedom of the press is extremely important. Freedom of speech, you cannot let your government take this away. Alright? You have to be able to express yourself, you have to be able to band together, and in some cases you have to be able to defy the government. And that wouldn't be possible without a newspaper. But anyway, here's a side-by-side comparison. You know, the news of yesterday, the news of tomorrow. Well, here, let me be more legit here. I can pull up their website. The news of yesterday and the news of tomorrow, today. The future, the past, the present, doesn't resonate. This doesn't quite hit the same. I mean, I miss reading a newspaper already. This isn't a newspaper, this is a little dinky little device. You know, how are people with vision problems supposed to read this? According to the Mail Tribune, everything that's in this paper here is on their website, themailtribune.com. But it's just different. Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. Huh? William Shakespeare said that like 500 years ago. Still true today. Well, folks, I guess the Medford Mail Tribune's print edition will literally end up in the ash heap of history. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I guess only time will tell. Well, I'll see you in the funny pages.